All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be going down a path that's maybe a little bit shadowy,
Ooh.
a little unnerving, but definitely captivating, I think.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about the dark side of human nature.
I love it.
Those parts of ourselves that we don't really like to talk about.
Yeah, and that can be a little daunting to confront those aspects of ourselves, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
The goal here is not to pass judgment or label anybody as good or bad or anything like that. It's really just to understand what makes us tick. The full spectrum of human behavior, including those darker elements.
Yes, the full spectrum. I love that. So where do we even begin with this idea of dark qualities?
That's a great question.
Right.
I think it starts with acknowledging that society tends to label certain human qualities as dark or evil.
Right.
Things like aggression, greed, lust, deception, even vengeance, narcissism.
Yeah, those are the heavy hitters for sure.
They are. And these qualities, they can lead to some pretty negative outcomes when they're taken to extremes or expressed in really harmful ways.
Right.
But here's the thing. These same qualities are also really powerful driving forces in human behavior. They can motivate us. They can protect us.
Okay.
And they can even help us navigate the complexities of the social world.
So it's not that these qualities are inherently bad. It's more about how they're expressed.
Exactly.
It's like we all have this potential for darkness, but it's up to us to decide how we're going to channel it.
Absolutely. And there's actually been quite a bit of research on this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for example, there's a study where they found that people who scored higher on measures of aggression were actually more likely to be successful in leadership roles.
Oh, that's interesting.
It seems kind of counterintuitive at first, but it makes sense when you think about it, because that drive, that assertiveness can actually be an asset in certain contexts.
Right. It's all about how you use it.
Exactly. It's all about context and expression. You know, take aggression, for example. If you're channeling that energy into a competitive sport, that can be incredibly beneficial. It can fuel your determination, your resilience, your drive to win.
Yeah, totally.
But if you're letting that same aggression erupt in like uncontrolled outbursts of anger, well, that's obviously a different story.
Yeah, no one wants to be around that person.
No, not really.
So it's almost like these dark qualities are like raw materials. They have the potential for both creation and destruction.
Yeah.
It's up to us to decide what we want to build with them.
I love that analogy. That's a really great way to put it. It's like with any raw material, you need the right tools and techniques to shape it into something useful.
Right.
And in this case, those tools are things like self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and a willingness to examine those darker impulses without judgment.
Okay, so if we try to ignore or repress those impulses altogether, what happens? Is that like trying to hold a beach ball underwater? It just pops up somewhere else, maybe in a messier way.
It is exactly like that.
Right.
Trying to suppress these natural human tendencies, it can really backfire. You know, it's like trying to dam a river. Eventually that pressure builds and something's got to give.
Right.
Think about it this way. If you're constantly bottling up your anger, it might eventually explode in an inappropriate outburst. Or if you're denying your feelings of lust, it might manifest in unhealthy fixations or even risky behaviors.
That makes a lot of sense. So instead of repression, the key is finding healthy ways to express these qualities.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but how do we do that? I mean, let's take greed, for example.
Yeah.
It's not exactly something we're encouraged to celebrate in our culture.
Right.
But is there a way to reframe it?
Yeah.
To see its potential for good?
There absolutely is. You know, at its core, greed is really about a desire for more.
Okay.
More resources, more experiences, more success. Now, when that desire becomes insatiable, when it's driven by a sense of lack or a need to constantly outdo others, that's when it can become really destructive and lead to some pretty negative behaviors. But what if we reframed greed as ambition? Okay.
What if we saw it as a driving force for innovation, for pushing boundaries, for creating something new and valuable in the world?
I like that. So instead of hoarding wealth, maybe it's about channeling that energy into building a successful business that provides jobs and contributes to the economy.
Exactly.
Or maybe it's about the pursuit of knowledge, that hunger to learn and grow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about transforming that raw desire into something that benefits not just ourselves, but also the world around us.
Yeah.
And that same principle applies to all of these dark qualities. It's about recognizing their power, understanding their potential pitfalls, and then finding creative and constructive ways to express them.
So we've talked about aggression and greed, two pretty heavy hitters in the dark quality arena.
Yeah, for sure.
But what about something like lust? This one seems especially tricky because it's so deeply tied to our physicality, our desires.
Yeah.
Is there a way to embrace this part of ourselves without falling into the trap of objectification or harmful behaviors?
There absolutely is, and I think it starts with reclaiming the word lust itself.
Okay. We often associate it with something purely sexual, something base, or even shameful.
Right.
But what if we broadened our understanding of lust to encompass a more expansive sense of desire?
Okay.
A yearning for connection, a passion for life itself.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So it's not just about physical attraction, it's about that spark, that intensity, that drive to experience life to the fullest.
Precisely. And that energy can be channeled in so many different ways. It can fuel our creative pursuits, our romantic relationships, our connection to nature, art, music.
Yeah.
Anything that ignites that fire within us, it's about finding those things that make us feel truly alive and embracing them with open hearts and a sense of reverence.
I love that, a sense of reverence. It's like recognizing the power of desire and choosing to express it in ways that are both fulfilling and respectful.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important point, the role of self-awareness in this whole process.
Right, because if we're not aware of our own tendencies, our triggers, our shadow side, we're kind of stumbling around in the dark, aren't we?
Exactly. Self-awareness is the foundation for everything else. It's about paying attention to our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors.
Right.
And noticing when those dark qualities are starting to emerge. And it's about being honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
Even when it's uncomfortable about what we're truly seeking and why.
So it's like having that internal check engine light that goes off when we're veering into dangerous territory.
Yeah.
And then we have the opportunity to pause, assess the situation, and choose a different course of action.
You got it. And that ability to choose to respond rather than react is what ultimately gives us the power to transform our dark side into a source of strength and growth.
This is already so much to think about.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into the how-to of it all,
Sure.
I'm curious about the potential consequences of not doing this work. What happens when these dark qualities run unchecked? Do they just sort of fizzle out, or do they morph into something more destructive?
Well, that's where things can get a bit tricky.
Uh-oh.
Because these qualities, while they have the potential for good, they also have a shadow side.
Right. And when they're not acknowledged, when they're not channeled appropriately, they can fester. Right. And manifest in some pretty unhealthy ways.
Ooh. Okay, now we're getting into the really juicy stuff.
Oh.
I'm all ears. Tell me more about this shadow side. What happens when these qualities go rogue?
All right, let's dive in. Well, it's important to remember that these qualities that we're calling dark, they exist on a spectrum.
Okay.
At one end, they can be powerful drivers of ambition, creativity, resilience.
Right.
But at the other end, when they're distorted or unbalanced or expressed in harmful ways, they can have some pretty devastating consequences.
Okay, so let's take a walk on the dark side, so to speak.
Let's do it.
Give me some examples of how these qualities can manifest in a negative way.
Okay, so let's start with aggression.
Okay.
We've talked about how it can be channeled into healthy competition.
Right.
But when it's taken to an extreme, it can lead to violence, abuse, and a need to dominate others.
Right.
Think about dictators who use aggression to control entire populations, or bullies who prey on the vulnerable. Yeah, that's a pretty stark contrast to that image of the athlete channeling their aggression into a winning performance.
It is.
It seems like the difference lies in whether that aggression is directed inward, towards self-improvement and achievement, or outward towards harming or controlling others.
You hit the nail on the head. It's all about intention and expression.
Okay.
Now let's consider greed.
Okay.
When greed becomes this insatiable hunger for more, it can really warp our values and lead to some ruthless behaviors.
Okay.
Think about corporate executives who prioritize profits over people or individuals who are willing to cheat, steal, or exploit others to get ahead.
Right. It's like that classic tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Yeah. That transformation from a seemingly respectable individual into someone who's consumed by their darker impulses.
It is.
It's a reminder that we all have this capacity for both good and evil, and that the line between the two can be surprisingly thin.
Exactly. And that's why self-awareness is so crucial. It's about recognizing those moments when our dark qualities are starting to take over and making a conscious choice to steer ourselves back on course.
Okay, let's talk about lust.
Yeah.
We've reframed it as a broader sense of desire and passion.
Right.
But what happens when that desire becomes obsessive or fixated on something that's ultimately harmful?
Well, think about addiction, whether it's to substances, gambling, or even another person. That intense craving, that need for fulfillment, It can override our better judgment and lead us down a path of self-destruction.
Right.
And when lust is combined with a lack of respect for others, it can manifest in behaviors like sexual harassment, assault, or infidelity, all of which can have devastating consequences for everyone involved.
Right. It's a reminder that even the most powerful emotions, even those that are deeply rooted in our biology, need to be tempered with a sense of responsibility and respect for ourselves and others.
Absolutely. And that brings us to deception.
Okay.
We've talked about how it can be a tool for persuasion and influence.
Right.
But when it's used for malicious purposes, it can become incredibly destructive.
Okay.
Think about con artists who prey on vulnerable people, or politicians who spread misinformation to gain power.
Deception can be so insidious because it often operates under the guise of trustworthiness.
It does.
It's like that saying, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Right.
When we're being deceived, we're often the last to know.
Yeah.
And the consequences can be far-reaching.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to be discerning consumers of information,
Right.
to question our assumptions, and to be wary of those who seem too good to be true. Because deception, when it's wielded skillfully, can be incredibly difficult to detect.
Okay, let's tackle another big one, vengeance.
Okay.
We've talked about how it can be transformed into a desire for growth and self-improvement.
Right.
But what happens when that desire for retribution takes over?
Well, think about those classic revenge stories where the protagonist becomes so consumed by their quest for vengeance that they end up destroying themselves in the process.
Yeah.
Vengeance can be a powerful motivator,
Right.
but it can also be incredibly corrosive. It can lead to bitterness, resentment, and a cycle of retaliation that can span generations.
It's like that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Oh, I like that one.
Vengeance might seem satisfying in the moment, but it rarely brings true peace or resolution.
Exactly. And it's often fueled by a sense of righteousness, a belief that we're somehow entitled to inflict pain on those who have wronged us.
Right.
But that kind of thinking can be incredibly dangerous. It can lead us to justify all sorts of harmful behaviors and ultimately prevent us from healing and moving forward.
So it's about finding a way to let go of that anger and resentment.
Yeah.
Not for the other person's sake, but for our own.
It is.
Because holding on to that pain ultimately only hurts us in the end.
That's such an important point. Forgiveness isn't about condoning the other person's actions. It's about freeing ourselves from the burden of anger and resentment. It's about choosing to focus on our own well-being and creating space for healing and growth.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about narcissism.
Right.
We've discussed how a healthy dose of self-belief can be positive.
Right.
But what happens when that self-focus becomes excessive and starts to damage our relationships and our ability to connect with others?
Well, think about those individuals who are so preoccupied with themselves, their image, their achievements, that they have little capacity for empathy or genuine connection. They might be charming and charismatic on the surface.
Yeah.
Underneath, there's often a deep well of insecurity and a need for constant validation.
Right, and those relationships could be incredibly draining because it's all about meeting the narcissist's needs.
Yeah.
Never about reciprocity or genuine care.
Right.
It's like being in a one-sided relationship where you're constantly giving but never receiving.
Exactly. And the narcissist, despite their outward confidence, is often deeply unhappy and unfulfilled because their sense of self-worth is entirely dependent on external validation.
Okay.
They're constantly chasing the next achievement, the next compliment, the next fleeting moment of admiration.
Right.
But it never seems to be enough.
It's like they're trying to fill a bottomless pit with something that can never truly satisfy them.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why it's so important to cultivate a sense of self-worth that comes from within, not from external sources.
Okay.
It's about recognizing our inherent value as human beings, regardless of our achievements or what others think of us.
Wow, this conversation has really highlighted the importance of finding that balance between expressing these dark qualities in a healthy way and recognizing when they're starting to veer into destructive territory.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of it comes down to self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and having those healthy outlets for these powerful energies.
You've absolutely nailed it. It's about understanding ourselves, our tendencies, our triggers,
Right.
and then making conscious choices about how we want to show up in the world.
Right.
And it's about recognizing that these dark qualities are part of what makes us human. They're not something to be ashamed of or afraid of, but rather something to be understood, integrated, and ultimately harnessed for good.
So we've talked about the dark side of these qualities, the potential pitfalls and consequences of letting them run wild.
Right.
But let's shift gears now and talk about the flip side.
Okay.
How we can actually transform these dark qualities into something positive, something that can actually benefit us and the world around us.
I love that. It's about reclaiming those parts of ourselves that we've been taught to repress and recognizing their potential for good. Because just as these qualities can lead us down a path of destruction, they can also be incredibly powerful forces for positive change.
Okay, I'm ready for a dose of optimism.
All right.
Let's talk about how we can actually turn our dark side into a superpower.
Let's do it. So let's start with aggression. We've talked about how it can manifest as violence or a need to dominate, but what if we channeled that same energy into a fierce determination to achieve our goals, to overcome obstacles, to fight for what we believe in?
So it's about transforming that raw energy into a force for positive action.
Exactly. And greed, as we mentioned earlier, can be a powerful motivator for innovation and self-improvement.
Okay.
When it's channeled appropriately, it can drive us to learn new skills, explore new possibilities, and push ourselves beyond our comfort zones.
It's like that saying, the only person you should try to be better than is the person you were yesterday.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Now, lust, as we've discussed, is all about desire and passion.
Right.
And that same energy can be directed toward our creative pursuits, our relationships, and our connection to something larger than ourselves.
So it's about channeling that intensity and focus into something meaningful and fulfilling.
Exactly. And deception, as we've explored, can be a tool for persuasion and influence. When used ethically, it can help us communicate effectively, negotiate successfully, and even inspire others to take action.
So it's about using our communication skills to create positive change, not to manipulate or control others.
Precisely. And vengeance, as we discussed earlier, can be transformed into a powerful motivator for self-improvement and growth.
Yeah.
We can use that experience of being wronged as fuel to become stronger, wiser, and more resilient.
It's like turning that pain into purpose.
Exactly. And finally, narcissism, while it can be incredibly destructive, can also be a source of confidence and leadership.
Okay.
When it's tempered with humility and empathy, it can inspire us to set ambitious goals and to strive for excellence in all that we do.
So it's about finding that balance between self-belief and a genuine concern for others.
Absolutely. And remember, it's not about denying these qualities.
Right.
It's about understanding them, accepting them, and finding ways to express them in a way that benefits both ourselves and the world around us.
I love that. It's like we're reclaiming our dark side and using it as a force for good.
Exactly. We're integrating all aspects of ourselves, embracing our complexity, and realizing our full potential as human beings. But how do we actually go about doing that?
Right.
How do we take these abstract concepts and turn them into concrete actions?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've laid the groundwork, explored the complexities, and now it's time to get practical. How do we actually start putting these ideas into practice in our daily lives?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Feels like we've already gone quite a journey, in this deep dive. From confronting those shadowy parts of ourselves to, actually glimpsing their potential for good. But I think you're right. It's time to bridge that gap between concept and action. How do we actually harness these dark qualities in a way that aligns with our values and helps us become like the best versions of ourselves?
It's a fantastic question, and that's really where the rubber meets the road, right?
Yeah.
It's where the real work begins. And remember, we're not talking about, quick fixes or easy solutions here. This is really about an ongoing process of self-discovery, a commitment to understanding ourselves more deeply, and a willingness to challenge those ingrained patterns of behavior that might be holding us back.
Okay, so it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
But where do we even start? What are some practical steps that we can take to get on the right path?
Well, I think, as we've mentioned repeatedly, self-awareness is the foundation for everything else.
Okay.
It's like having a roadmap of our own internal landscape. It allows us to identify those areas where our dark qualities are most likely to emerge.
Right. So it's about becoming familiar with our own tendencies, our triggers, those situations where we might be more susceptible to reacting impulsively or letting those, less than ideal qualities take over.
Exactly. It's about paying attention to our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, and noticing the patterns that emerge. Maybe you notice that you tend to get more irritable and aggressive when you're feeling stressed or sleep deprived.
Right.
Or perhaps you recognize that you're more likely to make impulsive decisions when you're feeling insecure or threatened.
It's like becoming a detective of our own minds.
It is.
Gathering evidence, piecing together the clues, and uncovering those hidden motivations and patterns that might be driving our behavior.
Precisely. And the more we understand ourselves, the better equipped we are to make conscious choices about how we respond in those challenging moments.
Okay, so self-awareness is key, but then what? How do we actually shift those ingrained patterns? How do we go from simply observing our tendencies to actually transforming them?
That's where things get really interesting. It's about developing what psychologists call emotional regulation, which is really just the ability to manage our emotions effectively and to choose our responses rather than reacting impulsively.
So it's like creating a space between stimulus and response.
Yes.
That pause where we have the opportunity to say, okay, I'm feeling angry right now, but I don't have to lash out. I can choose a different way to express this emotion.
Exactly. And that space, that pause, that's where the magic happens.
I like that.
It's where we can tap into our higher selves, our values, our wisdom, and choose a course of action that aligns with who we truly want to be.
I love that. The idea that we have this inherent power to choose even in the midst of intense emotions.
We do.
It's incredibly empowering. But it also sounds like a lot of hard work.
It can be, yeah.
Are there any tools or techniques that can help us develop this emotional regulation muscle?
Absolutely. There are a wealth of resources available, everything from mindfulness practices to cognitive behavioral therapy techniques that can help us become more aware of our emotions, understand their triggers, and develop healthier coping mechanisms.
So mindfulness might help us become more present and aware of those early warning signs that we're heading into dark territory.
Yeah.
While CBT might provide us with some practical strategies for managing those impulses and choosing a different response.
Exactly. And beyond those specific techniques, I think it's also incredibly helpful to cultivate a supportive community, whether it's through therapy, a support group, close friendships where we can feel safe to explore these challenging aspects of ourselves without judgment.
Right, because let's face it, this work can be uncomfortable at times.
It can.
It requires us to be honest with ourselves, to confront those parts of ourselves that we might prefer to keep hidden.
Yeah.
Having a supportive community can make that process a lot less daunting.
Absolutely. It's about creating a space where we can feel seen, heard, and accepted for who we truly are, including those shadowy parts of ourselves.
So we've talked about self-awareness, emotional regulation, the importance of community. Are there any other key ingredients in this recipe for transforming our dark side?
Well, I think it's also crucial to find healthy outlets for those powerful energies.
Yeah.
Remember, these dark qualities aren't inherently bad. They're simply energies that need to be channeled appropriately.
So if we're feeling aggressive, maybe that means hitting the gym or engaging in a competitive sport or even just channeling that energy into a challenging project at work.
Exactly. And if we're feeling greedy, maybe that means setting ambitious goals, but also making sure that those goals are aligned with our values and our desire to contribute to something larger than ourselves.
What about lust?
Yeah.
How can we channel that intense energy in a way that's both fulfilling and respectful?
Well, as we've discussed, lust is all about passion and desire.
Right.
So we can direct that energy toward our creative pursuits, our romantic relationships, or even our connection to nature, beauty, or spirituality. It's about finding those things that make us feel truly alive and embracing them with open hearts and a sense of reverence.
I love that, a sense of reverence. It's like recognizing the power of desire and choosing to express it in ways that are both life-affirming and enriching.
Precisely. And for deception, it might mean using our communication skills to inspire others to build consensus or to advocate for a cause we believe in.
Okay.
It's about using our powers of persuasion for good, not for manipulation or personal gain.
And for vengeance, it might mean channeling that energy into a desire to overcome adversity, to prove ourselves, or to create something positive out of a negative experience.
Yeah.
It's about turning that pain into purpose, as you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. And finally, for narcissism, it might mean using our confidence and leadership skills to empower others to inspire change or to make a positive impact on the world.
Okay.
It's about finding that balance between self-belief and a genuine desire to serve others.
Wow, this has been such an illuminating conversation. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on these so-called dark qualities and their potential for good. It's almost like we've been given this incredible gift, this raw power, and it's up to us to decide how we use it.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. There will be times when we stumble, when we make mistakes, when we fall back into old patterns. But the key is to keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving to become the best versions of ourselves.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and wisdom with us today.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the journey of self-discovery is ongoing. Keep exploring those shadowy corners of yourself. Keep asking questions and keep embracing the full spectrum of your human experience.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the dark side of human nature and its potential for transformation. We'll be back soon with more fascinating dives into the depths of human experience. Until then, keep diving deep.